Welcome to our journey of transformation. We have just begun the sixth stage of our journey, the transformed church. And now we're going to look at the second study in that part of our journey, and it will be called The Meaning of the Church. But first we're going to read from Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 to 30. Matthew 11, 28 to 30. That's where Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Think for a moment of the word church. What an incredible variety of images and associations comes to our mind when we think about this word. For some people, church recalls people, a family, friendship, support, acceptance, and for others, unfortunately and paradoxically, exclusion, isolation, and judgment. Church might bring to mind a confusion of names and beliefs that distinguish one religious group from another. For some, church may instantly recall images of a building, sometimes a marvel of architecture, sometimes simple, without adornment. For some, it represents a sacred place to feel the presence of God, and for others, it is just a place for group meetings. Jesus promised, "I will build my church," Matthew 16, verse 18. As believers in Jesus, we want to know what he originally intended as the nature and purpose of the church that he built. But to understand the teaching he left for us so many centuries ago, we have to do our best to rid our minds of these present images that church calls forth, as well as any other preconceived ideas we might have formed, and allow the New Testament to speak freely. Freeing ourselves is indeed difficult, but freeing ourselves is a necessary step toward freeing the New Testament to speak to us freely. The New Testament was originally written in Greek, the common language in the Mediterranean area in the first century. In our English versions of the New Testament, the word church is an English translation of the Greek word Ekklesia. Ekklesia was actually a common Greek word that described any assembly or gathering of people that was called out or invited to come together for a specific purpose. It literally meant those who are called out. The word did not necessarily imply that there was some prior relationship between the people coming together, that they were friends or members of the same community, but only that they were invited to come together for a common purpose. Luke, the writer of the book of Acts in the New Testament, even used Ekklesia to describe a group of people in the city of Ephesus who had come together to protest the preaching of Paul, the apostle of Jesus. The small group of protesters quickly grew into an angry crowd who grabbed two of Paul's associates and dragged him into the open-air theater. Luke reported the assembly, Ekklesia, was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing and some another. Acts 19, verse 32. In this case, the word described a mass of people gathered in a theater who were not entirely sure why they had come together. The word simply referred to assemblies of people called together for many purposes. But the New Testament writers also used Ekklesia as a term that came to be rich in meaning when it referred to the followers of Jesus. During the 3.5 years that Jesus spent walking across the length and breadth of Palestine teaching, he invited people to come together and follow him. To people who were tired of superficial and hypocritical religion, he said the words we just read from Matthew 11, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." On another occasion, while in Jerusalem during one of the principal feasts of the Jews, he exclaimed, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." John 7, verse 37 to 38. Sometimes his call for people to come together was as simple as the words, "Follow me," spoken to a tax collector, Matthew. Where was he taking them? To what? Or better to ask, to whom was he taking them? He told his followers, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. John 14, 6-7. Jesus was calling them, inviting them to come to have a relationship with the Creator as their Father. He was inviting them to know the Father because he, Jesus the Son, was the revelation and expression of the character and power of the Father. To know the Son was to know the Father, and he was inviting them to a personal relationship with the Father by becoming children of the Father, living transformed lives in his image. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus invited his followers to be children of God by living in love as God is love. He promised, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." Matthew 5, verse 9. He challenged his followers to be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Luke 6, verse 36. And if we love with the same unconditional love with which the Father loves us, we will be like him. Jesus said, "Love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be called children of the Most High." Luke 6, verse 35. All of Jesus' teaching was like an invitation, calling people out from their lives lived in selfishness and despair, to come together to live for a new purpose, to love God, heart, soul, mind, and strength, by living in love as he is love. Many people literally followed him wherever he went, providing an eager audience, drawing in others as he paused to teach. It is interesting, though, that the authors of the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, whose biographies of Jesus describe his life and teachings, did not use Ekklesia to describe these first groups of followers. Many of the teaching moments were informal, along the seashore, on the side of a hill, or in the middle of a town, often in a sudden moment after healing a blind or crippled person. Some of the people following and listening were dedicated disciples who believed that Jesus had come from God. Others were simply curious. And at the other extreme, serious opponents looking for a chance to accuse him of teaching something false. It was once while predicting his own death that Jesus told his followers, "I will build my church." But his followers at that time undoubtedly did not understand what Ekklesia, or assembly, he was referring to, and how he would build it in the future. They must have understood that Jesus was calling them to come, but at that point, they could not have known yet what the Ekklesia would come to mean to them. They would not know until after his death and resurrection. Jesus was preparing them for what would come. Very soon after his resurrection, when Jesus returned to his Father and sent his Spirit to live in believers, they began meeting together, sometimes in homes, sometimes in more public places like courtyards, to teach and encourage each other in their new life, and to sing and to pray to the Father, according to what we read in Acts 2, verse 42-47. Their meetings quickly became regular and included the Lord's Supper, the simple memorial of Jesus' death and resurrection that many of them had personally witnessed. In the book of Acts, Luke records these beginnings when the disciples started coming together, usually in small assemblies. He used for the first time in the New Testament the word Ekklesia to describe the believers, not just to describe their meetings, but to describe them as a people. They were the committed ones who had paid attention to the call of Jesus and who had come together with others who shared the same determination to live transformed lives with the Father. They would now be the ones who would go out to proclaim the invitation to come to have new life with God, whom they now love deeply as their Heavenly Father. After his resurrection, shortly before he returned to the Father, Jesus told his disciples, "Go and make disciples of all nations." Matthew 28, verse 19. Jesus' invitation to live with the Father, reflecting the Father's mercy and kindness, was provocative but persuasive. He was calling everyone to come together to live in the presence of one Creator. His disciples went out to call people to come to the Father during a time when society in the Roman Empire was most divided by race, ethnicity, culture, class, and by selfishness, envy, and hatred. In the church, the Ekklesia, Jew and Gentile, slave and free, found themselves meeting together in the same assemblies, sharing the Lord's Supper, and helping each other live transformed lives. They could never have imagined having such a close relationship with each other. They had been complete strangers, even rivals and enemies, but now a profound bond had quickly formed between them. They became more than a gathering of people. They became a community or a fellowship. These words, community or fellowship, describe people who share in something and participate together. We usually think of community as referring to people who live in the same area or neighborhood. But the Ekklesia formed a fellowship of people who were from distant places and different cultures, and nevertheless participated joyfully together on the deepest level of their existence. What did they share? Their fellowship arose from their spirits. They all shared the desire of their spirits to know God and be known by Him. Instead of denying what their spirits desired, they freed themselves from preconceived ideas and let their spiritual thirst lead them to the Father. They had all come to discover the truth of Jesus' teaching, that we can all have an intimate relationship with the Creator as our Father by living in love. Their mutual commitment to know the Father by following Jesus meant that they all belonged to Jesus. They were His Ekklesia, His church, the ones who had responded to His call. More than this, they understood that His death on the cross was meant to free them from the guilt of their past lives in order to have the power to live this new life. They belonged to Him because He had paid this incomparable price for their freedom. Then, on an even more profound level, they shared the experience of being born again to begin a new life, sharing in the same Spirit that gives life. From the very beginning, shortly after the death and resurrection of Jesus, believers were immersed in the waters of baptism for the forgiveness of their sins and to receive God's Spirit. Acts 2, verse 36 to 41. God's Spirit living in them gave life to their spirits and empowered them to live the new life. At that moment, when His Spirit began to live in them, they were born again as the children of God, adopted by the Father to form part of His family. So the assembly of Jesus was not just a group of people meeting in the same place, but a fellowship of believers, sharing an identity that was infinitely more meaningful than any cultural, ethnic, or racial relationships. What they shared was their spiritual identity and life as children of the Father. In his letter to the church at Ephesus, Paul reminded the members of the Ekklesia that the Father had brought them from many different backgrounds and origins to form His own household. Now they belonged, all of them, to the same family. As members of God's family, the Ecclesia of Jesus was still the assembly of Jesus, even when the members of His assembly were not assembled together in a physical place. And just like the members of a family are still family members and form a family, even when they are not together in one place. They are related, not by being in the same place at the same time, but by being born into the same family. So the assembly of Jesus came to refer not just to the meetings of the followers of Jesus, but to His followers themselves, to describe the relationship between them as believers who had been born again as children of God. They did not go to church, but instead they were the church, even when they were not meeting together. The Ecclesia of Jesus had nothing to do with a building or a specific place they considered to be sacred to meet God. They knew that in any given moment, they shared profound spiritual bonds that connected them with fellow believers who might have been their rivals or even enemies at an earlier time. They were now all one family focused on living a transformed life in the image of the same Father. As the good news of salvation and transformation spread in the first century in distant parts of the Roman Empire, assemblies of believers who were born again and committed themselves to transformation formed in many towns and cities. There was the Church of God in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. The churches in Galatia, Galatians 1 and 2. And the church of the Laodiceans, according to Colossians 4, verse 16. The churches in these cities were all part of the assembly of Jesus, the Ekklesia, believers born again as children of God, learning to live in the image of God. Through the work of his followers, spreading the good news, Jesus was doing what he had promised he would do. He was building his church. Now here's a couple of questions. Explain in your own words what it means that the church is an Ekklesia and a fellowship and a family. And then, what can you do to increase the depth of your relationships with members of Jesus' church? So until next time, when we further our study about the transformed church, may God bless you.